Hello, everyone. The U.S. recklessly imposed a full embargo on Russia. Putin responded terribly. Details right now. The world entered the new year with a feeling that the old rules no longer work. From January 1st, 2026, the United States announced a full economic embargo against Russia. The wording sounded dry, almost bureaucratic, but at its core, it was a step that many experts called reckless, not because it was unexpected, but because its consequences were pre-calculated as extremely risky. And almost immediately, there was a response, which in classified reports is already called a response of terrible force. Today, we will figure out why Washington decided to take such a tough step from the beginning of the year, what a full embargo actually means in modern conditions, and what Vladimir Putin's response was, which brought the situation to a completely different level. Watch until the end, because in the course of the conversation, we will answer two key questions. First, was this embargo the last argument or the beginning of an uncontrolled chain reaction? Second, why did the Russian response turn out to be much broader than the economy and affect the very architecture of the global world? Let's start with the fact. From January 1st, 2026, the United States officially introduced a full package of restrictions that affects trade, financial transactions, logistics, technology, and third, countries cooperating with Russia. Unlike previous waves of sanctions, this is not about sectoral measures, but about an attempt at maximum isolation. This is a step that the White House took for a long time and with obvious internal resistance. Why is this important? Because a full embargo in today's interconnected world is not just pressure on one country. It is an intervention in supply chains, markets, energy, and finance in several regions at once. Such a step inevitably hits not only the target, but also those who introduce it. That is why many U.S. allies tried to soften the wording until the very last moment. What does this change? From this moment, the conflict goes beyond the usual sanctions war. It becomes systemic, affecting the foundations of the global economy. And when such decisions are made from the beginning of the year, this means that they are included in strategic planning and are not considered as a temporary measure. Now let's figure out why this step is called reckless. It's not about emotions, but about calculations. Over the previous years, Russia has already adapted to the sanctions pressure, rebuilt part of the logistics, financial flows, and trade ties. A full embargo, instead of breaking the system, risks accelerating its final exit from the Western orbit. Why is this important? Because pressure is effective only when the target has no alternatives. In this case, there are alternatives, albeit not ideal ones. But for the global market, the loss of even a part of Russian resources and flows creates shortages and distortions that are difficult to quickly compensate. Now let's look at Moscow's reaction. Vladimir Putin's response was not emotional and was not accompanied by loud threats. It was cold, measured, and multi-layered. And this is what makes it terrible for opponents, because it is not about one step, but about a series of decisions that change the rules of the game. Why is this important? Because the strongest response is not the one that sounds loud, but the one whose consequences unfold gradually and affect many areas. This is the response that was chosen. The first level of response is energy. Russia has begun a phased revision of the terms of resource supplies to alternative markets, strictly linking them to national currencies and new financial instruments. This is a blow not so much to the United States directly, but to the system where the dollar has long been an undisputed payment instrument. Why is this sensitive? Because undermining confidence in the financial architecture always has long-term consequences. Even if the effect is not instantaneous, it accumulates, and each new contract outside the usual system is a small but significant shift. The second level of response is technological and industrial policy. In response to the embargo, Russia announced a complete revision of cooperation with companies and countries that supported the restrictions. But the key was not this, but the acceleration of import substitution and technological sovereignty programs. And not in isolation, but in cooperation with alternative centers of power. Why is this important? Because the embargo was supposed to stop development. But if it is used as an excuse to accelerate internal processes and external reorientation, the effect is reversed. This is not a quick path, but it is strategically dangerous for those who counted on stagnation. Now let's move on to the third, most unexpected level of response. This is diplomacy. Russia has begun active work to form blocs and agreements that bypass Western mechanisms. This is not about loud alliances, but about practical agreements in trade, logistics, security. Why is this scary for opponents? Because such processes are difficult to stop. They do not depend on one decision or one leader. If countries find mutual benefit outside the old structures, they continue to do so, even if the pressure increases. Now let's look at the reaction within the U.S. and its allies. Publicly, words are spoken about determination and necessity, but at the same time, anxiety is growing. Economists talk about risks for markets, industrialists about rising prices, politicians about voter dissatisfaction. A full embargo turned out to be not an abstract punishment, but a factor that is starting to boomerang. Why is this important? Because the sustainability of sanctions always depends on internal support. When citizens begin to feel the consequences for themselves, pressure on the government increases, and this limits the space for maneuver. Now, let's ask ourselves the question, did Washington have another choice? Probably yes. But the logic of escalation often pushes towards steps that seem to be the only possible ones. When previous measures did not produce the expected result, there is a temptation to go all in. A full embargo became such a step. Why is this dangerous? Because all in leaves no room for retreat. Any next step becomes even more risky. And if the response turns out to be asymmetrical and systemic, the situation gets out of control. Now let's go back to Putin's response and why it is called a response of terrible force. Terrible not because of the destruction, but because of the depth. It is not aimed at an instant effect. It is aimed at changing the structure of the world in which the United States has become accustomed to playing a key role. Why does this change the perspective? Because we are not dealing with a duel, but with a restructuring of the field. And in such a field, the winner is not the one who hits harder, but the one who adapts better and creates new rules. Now, let's take stock. The full embargo from January 1st, 2026 became a point of no return for the previous model of pressure. Russia's response showed that the bet was not on a retaliatory strike, but on a long game, where each step strengthens the next. What does this mean for the coming months? We will see an increase in instability in the markets, an increase in diplomatic activity, attempts to revise alliances and formats. The world will become less predictable, but more honest in one sense. The illusion of unilateral control will disappear. It is important to emphasize that this is not about an immediate collapse or victory. It's about the process. And it is this process that scares those who are accustomed to the status quo, because it cannot be quickly stopped or canceled. Now let's formulate the main conclusion. The U.S. decision on a full embargo was an attempt to put an end to it. Putin's response turned this point into a comma, followed by a new, much more complex phrase in world history. And this phrase is only just beginning to be written. Write in the comments how you assess this step and the response to it. Do you consider the embargo to be the last argument or a mistake that will accelerate global changes? Because it is such decisions that determine not only the outcome of conflicts, but also the face of the world in which we all have to live on. Let's continue, because it is after the first statements and cold formulations that the consequences that cannot be canceled with one stroke of the pen begin to manifest themselves. A full embargo is not a button that can be pressed and forgotten. This is a process that triggers chains, and each of them lives with its own logic. And it is here that Russia's response begins to unfold in all its depth, going far beyond the initial expectations. The first thing that became obvious in the first weeks after the introduction of the embargo was the effect of disrupting the usual economic rhythms. Companies that have worked for years through complex but well-established schemes suddenly found themselves in a situation where old routes are closed and new ones have not yet been fully formed. And here it is important to emphasize that the blow was not only to Russia. It went through the entire system, which for decades was built around globalization and interdependence. Why is this important? Because the embargo was conceived as an instrument of pressure, but in practice, it became a stress test for the entire world economy. Countries that formally supported Washington's decision faced rising prices, shortages, and the need to urgently seek alternatives. And these alternatives do not always coincide with political attitudes. Now let's see how exactly Russia began to use this situation. Putin's response was not reduced to one decree or one speech. It manifested itself in a series of decisions that could seem technical individually, but together they formed a new strategy. It is about reorienting flows, creating parallel financial mechanisms, and fundamentally changing the approach to international obligations. Why is this scary for opponents? Because such changes do not roll back even with a softening of pressure. If a country has learned to work outside the usual system, it will no longer return to full dependence on it. And this means that the levers of influence that were considered universal are gradually losing effectiveness. Now let's pay attention to the energy factor. It was here that the embargo was supposed to inflict the most painful blow, but instead of the expected collapse, we saw an acceleration of processes that were previously spoken of as prospects. New routes, new partners, new formulas for calculations. This did not happen in one day, but the direction became obvious. Why is this important? Because energy is the basis of industry and social stability. Any disruptions here quickly affect domestic politics. And when the countries that supported the embargo began to face rising prices and popular discontent, enthusiasm began to decline noticeably. Now let's look at the financial sphere. Russia's response here turned out to be particularly sensitive. This is not about breaking with world markets, but about creating alternative circuits. The use of national currencies, new payment systems, an agreement on direct payments. All this reduces the role of the usual intermediaries and reduces the influence of sanctions mechanisms. Why does this change the rules of the game? Because financial power rests on trust and habit. When habit is broken and trust is undermined, the system begins to crack. And even if it does not collapse immediately, its stability decreases. Now let's look at the diplomatic dimension. After the introduction of the embargo, Russia intensified contacts with those countries that either did not support the restrictions or took a wait-and-see position. And here it is important to understand that it is not only about large powers. Regional actors are entering the game, for whom the new conditions open up opportunities. Why is this important? Because the world order is made up not only of the decisions of the great powers, it is formed at the level of specific agreements, projects, and initiatives. And when there are more such initiatives outside the Western orbit, the balance begins to shift. Now let's go back to the U.S. and their internal reaction. The full embargo has become a subject of heated discussions. Business talks about losses, farmers about sales markets, industry about rising costs. Politicians are forced to explain why the tough course must be continued, despite growing discontent. Why is this important? Because any foreign policy has a domestic price, and when this price becomes too high, the space for maneuver is reduced. This does not mean an immediate abandonment of the course, but it does mean an increase in internal tension. Now let's ask ourselves the question, was Russia's response expected? Partially yes, in general terms, but the scale and sequence of steps turned out to be unexpected for many. Especially unexpected was the absence of sharp rhetoric. Instead of loud words, quiet but systemic actions followed. Why does this enhance the effect? Because loud threats mobilize the enemy. Quiet changes force him to catch up and react post factum. This is the strength of the chosen strategy. Now let's look at the global effect. The full embargo accelerated the processes of fragmentation of the world. The economy is increasingly divided into blocks. Financial systems are duplicated. Logistics are becoming more complicated. This makes the world less efficient, but more resistant to unilateral pressure. Why is this paradoxical? Because the tool designed to increase control ultimately reduces it. The more centers of power, the more difficult it is to manage the system from one point. Now, let's sum up another important result. The response of terrible force is not about a one-time strike. It's about changing the trajectory, about moving away from dependence and imposing a new reality in which the old levers work worse and worse. What does this mean for the near future? We will see an increase in the number of non-standard alliances, an increase in regional initiatives, a further weakening of universal rules. The world will become more complex and less predictable. And here is the main conclusion that we are approaching. The full embargo was an attempt to put a final point in the pressure. Russia's response turned this point into the beginning of a new chapter, where strength is measured not by the loudness of statements, but by the ability to rebuild and withstand a long distance. Write in the comments, do you think this course will lead to a final break in the old system or to its painful transformation? Because the outcome of the current confrontation and what the world will be like in the coming years depends on this choice. Yes,